Welcome to Legacy of Ages, where wars are transformed into narratives. The year is 1885 and winter has gripped Sudan, its very core trembling from the relentless thunder of war. For almost a year, Khartoum, the shining jewel of the Nile and a crucial outpost of British authority, has stood in defiance against seemingly insurmountable odds. Governor-General Charles Gordon, the empire's famously stubborn guardian, commands a garrison of approximately 7,000 men. They are exhausted, desperately hungry, and completely surrounded. The Mahdist army, a force of around 50,000 strong, is closing in like a tightening noose. Day after day, the Nile has carried ominous whispers of impending doom. But now the whispers have escalated into screams. The walls of Khartoum have finally been breached. The defenders, once filled with such pride, are now crumbling before a relentless tide of men wielding swords, spears, and rifles seized from previous victories. The streets that once teemed with merchants and bustling camel caravans now echo with the sounds of gunfire and the agonizing cries of the dying. Civilians are being cut down alongside soldiers in the chaos. The city has devolved into a labyrinth of blood and fire. Yet amidst this overwhelming chaos, one man steadfastly refuses to flee. On the steps of his palace, adorned in full ceremonial uniform, as though he were attending a final grand parade, Charles Gordon waits. He has dismissed his staff, even sending away those who were loyal enough to share his grim fate. Only one bodyguard remains, serving as a final, silent witness to his master's unwavering dignity. Gordon makes no attempt to hide in the shadows. He does not reinforce the doors or create any barriers. Instead, he stands openly, almost inviting the Mahdist warriors to claim him. He fully understands that this is his last stand. To the British public, Gordon was once hailed as a hero, a man of unwavering iron will. He was greatly pardoned in China during the Taiping Rebellion, where he earned the distinguished title of Chinese Gordon. But those events transpired decades ago. Now, his hair is grey, his body is worn and weary, and his eyes carry the heavy burden of disillusionment. The empire that once celebrated him has now abandoned him. The promises of relief expeditions have arrived far too late. The Nile gunboats, the red-coated reinforcements, and the lifeline from Cairo, all delayed by indecision and hesitation in London. And so Gordon, once the empire's proud crusader, is reduced to becoming its martyr. He also understands that his death is not an isolated incident. The British Empire demands sacrifice, often without offering gratitude in return. Its servants, scattered across the far reaches of the globe, are expected to dedicate their time, their careers, and even their very lives for commerce, disguised as civilization. Gordon has witnessed this reality firsthand. The bitterness of the local populations displaced, the resentment of the rulers who have been toppled, and the sheer arrogance of imperial commands issued from across the vast sea. Now, as the Mahdist soldiers surge relentlessly closer, he understands that his death will be remembered not only as a profound tragedy, but as a stark symptom of something far deeper, the perilous arrogance inherent in empire. When the enemy finally arrives to confront him, Gordon does not raise his pistol in defense. Accounts differ on the precise details of that moment. Some say that he resisted, while others claim that he stood motionless. However, in every version of the story, he dies as he lived, unyielding, proud, and isolated. For the Mahdists, it is a resounding triumph, a potent symbol that even the empire's most renowned generals are capable of falling. For Britain, it is a humiliation that will resonate throughout Parliament, newspapers, and households for many years to come. Khartoum falls, but its story does not end with its capture. Within Gordon's death lies the perfect prologue to a much grander saga, the tale of how Britain came to Africa, how it bled in its relentless pursuit of control, and how, despite its numerous triumphs, the empire sowed the very seeds of its own undoing. Long before Khartoum's walls crumbled under the Mahdist swords, Britain's story in Africa began not with the thunder of cannon fire, but with the meticulous entries in counting houses. In 1618, under the reign of King James I, a charter was granted to the London-based Guinea Company. Its purpose was remarkably simple: to monopolize trade along the West African coast. There were no vast armies or imperial proclamations at this early stage, only ledgers, merchants, and the alluring promise of profit. Gold and timber were the first commodities to flow. However, it soon became apparent that human lives themselves represented the most profitable cargo. The transatlantic slave trade, already burgeoning under the control of Portuguese and Spanish interests, drew England into its bloody and inhumane current. Ships departed from English ports, laden with manufactured goods destined for Africa, where they were exchanged for captives. These captives were then transported across the Atlantic to be sold as slaves in the plantations of the Caribbean and the Americas. The return voyage carried sugar, rum, and tobacco, forming an unholy triangle in which misery served as the mortar that held the empire's foundations together. Yet these ventures were undeniably fragile. They were not colonies in the true sense of the word, but rather precarious outposts clinging tenuously to the humid, fever-ridden coastlines. Europeans ominously referred to it as the white man's grave. Sailors who dared to step ashore often carried their own coffins with them, fully aware that malaria, yellow fever, or dysentery could strike them down within a matter of weeks. The mortality rates were staggeringly high. Some posts witnessed nearly half of their European staff succumb to disease within a single year. Expansion inland was considered unthinkable. The dense jungle itself seemed to be a relentless enemy. And so, for more than a century, Britain's empire in Africa remained little more than a string of trading forts, scattered like beads along a shoreline. The great interior kingdoms, such as the Asante, Dahomey, and Oyo, remained mysterious powers glimpsed only through the filter of interpreters, caravans, and second-hand tales. London's financiers diligently calculated profits without bothering to learn the languages, customs, or political systems of the people they traded with. To them, Africa was merely a ledger entry, not a vibrant and complex land. Still, these early ventures established a precedent, defining Britain's relationship with Africa as transactional, exploitative, and deeply intertwined with violence. Yet it would take centuries and the collapse of Britain's first empire in America for Africa to transform from a realm of commerce to a stage for conquest. For now, the empire's African story remained relatively modest, its ambition constrained by disease and vast distances, but the seeds had been planted, and seeds once sown can lie dormant for generations before they finally sprout into destiny. The year was 1783, and Britain had just suffered a humiliating defeat that shook its empire to its very core, the loss of the American colonies. For generations, the New World had been regarded as the Great Experiment, a place where settlers could cultivate farms, build towns, and envision futures intimately tied to Britain's crown. But with independence declared and the 13 colonies now gone, London's gaze shifted elsewhere. If the empire could no longer expand westward across the Atlantic, perhaps Africa could serve as the next frontier for its ambitions. Yet, Africa was fundamentally different from America. Disease continued to stalk every coastline, posing a constant threat. European settlers who dreamed of carving out farms and plantations soon discovered that fever and parasites could kill far more quickly than any musket ball. The very idea of vast British settler colonies seemed almost absurd given these harsh realities. And so Britain decided to try something different, a new approach. In 1787, a new colony was founded in Sierra Leone, but not for merchants or planters. Instead, it was intended for the unwanted and displaced. Its first residents were freed slaves, men and women, who had bravely fought for Britain during the American Revolution. Promised protection and new lives, many had found themselves abandoned in Nova Scotia or London, living in conditions of abject poverty and facing rampant discrimination. Sierra Leone represented their second chance at a meaningful existence. Approximately 1,000 individuals made the arduous journey, establishing a fragile community planted in hostile soil. The symbolism inherent in this endeavor was powerful. A colony of the formerly enslaved, now living where the slave trade still thrived, created a stark and compelling contrast. But the reality on the ground was undeniably cruel. Within months, disease tore relentlessly through the settlement, claiming many lives. Graves multiplied far more quickly than homes could be built. Those who managed to survive endured raids from neighboring groups who were deeply resentful of the British intrusion. For London, Sierra Leone served as both an experiment and a symbol. The experiment starkly revealed that colonization would not be a simple or easy undertaking. Horrors of slavery now positioned itself as the liberator. It was essentially a moral mask, carefully worn over an empire that remained deeply dependent on the trade in human lives. The paradox was glaringly obvious for all to see. Britain claimed to be championing freedom and justice, while its ships continued to carry chains across the Atlantic, perpetuating the brutal cycle of enslavement. To the freed men and women in Sierra Leone, however, the inherent contradiction mattered far less than their very survival. They focused on building churches, establishing schools, and fostering a fragile sense of belonging within their community. Even as their numbers dwindled due to disease and hardship, their voices resonated in the African night, carrying hymns, prayers of gratitude, and defiant cries in equal measure. Though undeniably tiny and precarious, Sierra Leone served as a harbinger of things to come. It revealed both the immense hardships that Britain would inevitably face in colonizing Africa and the enduring determination to plant its flag firmly on the continent. Even in soil soaked with malaria and grief, Africa was no longer viewed solely as a marketplace. It was gradually transforming into an imperial project, born in the shadow of America's loss and carried forward on the shoulders of those who had once been enslaved. The empire had discovered a new stage upon which to project its power, though it remained largely unaware of the full scale of the drama that awaited it. While Britain's initial steps in West Africa were hesitant and tentative, the story unfolded in a strikingly different manner in the south. There on the very edge of the continent stood Cape Town, a settlement originally established by the Dutch in 1652 as a convenient resting station for ships sailing to Asia. For nearly a century and a half, Dutch farmers, known as Boers, had gradually spread inland, raising cattle and cultivating wheat in the rugged interior. But as the Napoleonic Wars erupted across Europe, the Cape's quiet importance became suddenly and acutely obvious. In 1795, when revolutionary France subjugated the Netherlands, Britain acted swiftly and decisively. The danger was undeniably clear. If France were to gain control of the Cape, the vital lifeline to India, the undisputed jewel of the crown, would be severely threatened. 2 squadrons of British warships promptly appeared in Table Bay, and soon the Union Jack proudly flew over Cape Town, signaling a new era of British control. Though initially conceived as a temporary wartime measure, the occupation gradually hardened into a sense of permanence. By 1814, the Cape Colony was formally integrated into the British Empire, solidifying its status as a permanent possession. At first, Britain cautiously promised not to interfere in the daily lives of the settlers, but promises made in the context of empire rarely lasted for long. Magistrates began issuing a stream of new laws, always written exclusively in English, blatantly disregarding the Dutch language and long-established customs. To the Boers, this was far more than mere bureaucratic meddling. They perceived it as a deliberate and calculated assault on their very identity. They had left Europe generations earlier, seeking freedom from persecution and the heavy hand of authoritarian rule. Now a new authority, foreign, condescending and seemingly aloof, claimed mastery over their land, threatening the hard-won autonomy they had so carefully cultivated. Cultural irritation soon deepened into simmering resentment. The British brought with them not only new laws, but also radically new ideas about society, race, and the issue of slavery. Under Dutch rule, slavery had been widely accepted and deeply integrated into the fabric of farm life. The British, by contrast, were moving, however haltingly, toward the abolition of slavery. To the Boers, abolition represented a direct threat to their economic survival and their established way of life. To the British, tolerating slavery was becoming increasingly untenable from a political standpoint. The collision between these conflicting ideologies was inevitable. The Cape thus became a crucible, a place where European powers clashed not only for control of the land, but also for the very definition of identity, values, and competing visions of the future. On its windswept plains, the seeds of future conflict were being sown with each passing day. For Britain, it was a strategic prize. a vital gateway to India and a crucial foothold for further expansion northward. For the Boers, it was home, a place they had toiled to build and protect. And home, once threatened, is defended with a ferocity that no empire, however powerful, can easily suppress or overcome. As the 19th century progressed, this underlying tension would drive thousands of Boers away from British rule, pushing them deeper into the uncharted interior of Africa. But before that great exodus, Britain's fateful decision to end slavery would ignite the fragile trust that existed between ruler and ruled, forever altering the landscape of South Africa. In 1833, the British Parliament officially declared slavery illegal across the entire empire. To London, it was a triumph of morality, the culmination of a long-fought campaign of conscience that had finally prevailed. To the Boers of South Africa, however, it was nothing less than a profound betrayal. Their livelihoods had been built upon the backs of enslaved labor, which was intricately woven into every aspect of farm life, every harvest and every household. When abolition finally came, it was not only the economic loss that cut so deeply, but also the manner in which it was imposed upon them by distant lawmakers, who neither sought their input nor listened to their concerns. Compensation was offered, but it was paltry, inadequate, and entangled in bureaucratic red tape. Boers farmers felt utterly cheated, as if they were being treated as mere subjects of an empire that neither respected their unique culture nor cared about their future well-being. For a people already deeply resentful of British interference in their lives, the abolition of slavery served as the final decisive spark. In their eyes, Britain had irrevocably crossed a line, transforming from a legitimate ruler into an oppressive force. And so began the Great Trek. Thousands of Dutch-speaking settlers packed their wagons, gathered their livestock, and resolutely turned their backs on Cape Town, severing their ties with British rule. Families pushed into the vast wilderness, traveling in long, arduous, ox-drawn caravans across unforgiving plains and treacherous rivers. It was less a simple migration and more of a powerful statement, a defiant act of self-determination. If they could not live freely under British rule, they would carve their own independence from the very heart of Africa itself. The journey was fraught with peril. Trekker diaries tell harrowing tales of swarms of locusts blotting out the sun, of wagons collapsing and being swept away in raging rivers, of children buried in shallow graves alongside the dusty roadside. Yet the Boers pressed onward, driven by their unwavering faith and sheer stubbornness. They saw themselves as modern Israelites, leaving behind a land of bondage in search of a promised land where they could live and worship freely. Preachers often compared them to biblical patriarchs, chosen by God to build a new and glorious destiny. As they moved inland, they encountered various African kingdoms, some openly hostile, others cautiously curious, some seeking peaceful negotiations, while others responded with violence. These complex encounters shaped the shifting map of southern Africa, forging unexpected alliances and igniting devastating wars. New Boer republics, tiny, fragile, but fiercely defiant, sprang up in distant valleys and on remote plateaus. They proudly called them the Orange Free State and the Transvaal, names that would one day echo in newspaper headlines across the world, capturing the attention of distant empires. For the British, the trek represented both a significant problem and a stark warning. It fractured their already tenuous hold on South Africa, but it also ensured that the seeds of future conflict had been scattered far and wide across the landscape. Where the British flag receded, resentment and bitterness followed closely behind. Where the Boers settled, they built not only thriving farms but also nascent nations that would one day boldly challenge the empire itself. The Great Trek was far more than a simple migration of people. It was a resounding declaration, a solemn vow that no empire, however powerful and far-reaching, could ever erase a people's inherent sense of destiny. While settlers and Boers wrestled over the fate of South Africa, Britain's attention was also drawn to the lush forests of the West. There, in what is now modern-day Ghana, rose the Asante Empire, a formidable state built upon a foundation of lucrative trade, abundant gold, and highly disciplined armies. But between the Asante and Britain, with each side deeply suspicious of the other's intentions. In 1824, the spark finally ignited the powder keg. An African officer serving in a British unit was brutally murdered by Asante warriors, an act that was deemed intolerable by the colonial governor of Sierra Leone, Sir Charles McCarthy. Firmly convinced that a swift demonstration of British military strength would swiftly resolve the matter, he marched into Asante territory with approximately 3,000 men. He naively believed himself to be the hammer, and the Asante merely brittle glass that would shatter upon impact. What he discovered instead was a force of forged iron, resilient and unyielding. At the banks of the Pra River, McCarthy's force encountered an overwhelming army of 10,000 Asante warriors. The British and their allies were swiftly overwhelmed, their ranks shattered by the sheer ferocity of the Asante attack. McCarthy himself was struck down and killed. The battle ended not in a decisive victory for the British, but in a brutal and devastating massacre. Barely a fraction of his original force managed to escape the carnage. What happened next ensured that his name would be remembered not for triumph or glory, but for humiliation and defeat. The Asante king, celebrating his stunning victory, had McCarthy's skull taken, meticulously polished and lavishly trimmed in gold. For years it was used as a drinking cup in the royal court, a macabre and deeply symbolic object that served as a potent trophy of defiance against the empire. To the British, this act was an unpardonable outrage, a deep scar on their national pride. To the Asante, it was a clear and unequivocal statement. They would not be bullied into submission by foreign powers who neither respected their sovereignty nor feared their considerable strength. For the moment, the empire had been checked and humbled. Yet Britain did not forget the humiliation they had suffered. 30 years later, when they returned to the Gold Coast with an even greater force, the memory of McCarthy's gilded skull still stung, fueling their thirst for vengeance and driving them toward treaties and eventually the capture of Kumasi itself. But in 1824, the lesson was bitterly clear and undeniable. Africa was no passive prize to be easily taken. Its kingdoms possessed sharp teeth, and they were more than willing to bite in defense of their sovereignty. The golden skull of McCarthy became more than just a relic of a bygone battle. It served as a stark warning that even the mightiest of empires could bleed. For decades after Charles McCarthy's skull was gilded and raised in Asante triumph, an uneasy truce held between the two powers. In 1831, a treaty was signed, drawing the Praia River as the formal border between British and Asante spheres of influence. Trade resumed, but the underlying tension between the two sides never truly vanished. Both sides watched the other wearily, waiting for the inevitable next spark that would ignite the conflict once again. That spark came when Britain, seeking to expand its coastal footholds in the region, acquired the Dutch Gold Coast colony. To the Asante, this was far more than mere opportunistic expansion. It was an act of egregious intrusion, slowly strangling their trade and directly threatening their long-held authority in the region. Skirmishes escalated into full-scale war once again. This time, Britain arrived with a more professional and better-equipped army, numbering approximately 2,500 men armed with modern rifles, powerful artillery, and Congreve rockets that streaked like fire across the sky, inspiring terror and awe. The campaign that followed was short and utterly devastating for the Asante. The Asante fought with unwavering determination and remarkable courage, but they were ultimately outmatched by the empire's superior firepower and relentless advance. In 1874, British troops pushed relentlessly into Kumasi, the Asante capital. What they discovered there astonished them: a sprawling palace filled with countless books, breathtaking artworks, intricate ivory carvings, and untold treasures, all testament to a kingdom far more sophisticated and cultured than the simplistic caricatures of savages so often painted in London's newspapers. But admiration quickly gave way to a destructive impulse. The British, following a pattern repeated across the African continent, did not seek to preserve what they found. Instead, they systematically dismantled it, piece by piece. The palace was stripped bare, looted of its valuable artifacts, and then blown apart with explosives, reducing it to a pile of rubble. Priceless artifacts of Asante heritage vanished into private collections and were scattered across museum halls half a world away, never to be seen again by their rightful owners. The city itself was left in ruins, its former grandeur reduced to dust and ashes. For Britain it was a resounding victory, clear proof that the empire's might could humble even Africa's proudest kingdoms. For the Asante, it was a catastrophic defeat, a humiliation that burned as bitterly as McCarthy's defeat had once burned Britain. Yet, the story was far from over. The Asante would rise again, fiercely resisting British encroachment in future wars until their final subjugation at the very dawn of the 20th century. In Kumasi's destruction lay the very essence of empire, a perplexing paradox of awe and annihilation. The British marveled at the remarkable achievements they found, only to then systematically destroy them, as if the empire could only truly prove its dominance by erasing the achievements and legacies of others. In 1867, a young boy playing on the banks of the Orange River stumbled upon a curious stone. It glittered strangely in the sunlight, and when brought to local traders, it was confirmed to be a diamond of considerable value. Soon more diamonds were discovered near the dusty settlement of Kimberley, igniting a feverish rush that would irrevocably transform southern Africa forever. Within a single decade, Kimberley had swollen from a sleepy, unremarkable outpost into a bustling boomtown, attracting prospectors from across the far reaches of the empire. Britons, Boers, Africans, and fortune seekers of every conceivable background poured into the area, all driven by the insatiable desire for wealth. Tents quickly gave way to makeshift shacks, and shacks to more permanent wooden buildings, while the ground itself was torn open and scarred by thousands of hands frantically clawing for their fortune. From the earth emerged not only diamonds, but also intense conflict and deep-seated rivalries. For Britain, the discovery of diamonds was like a thunderclap, a moment of profound and transformative significance. Diamonds meant wealth, and wealth translated directly into power and influence on the global stage. The Cape Colony was no longer just a strategic outpost guarding the vital route to India. It was now a treasure chest, waiting to be pried open and plundered for its riches. But the most valuable riches lay far beyond Cape Town's immediate reach, deep in territories controlled by independent Boer republics and powerful African kingdoms. To secure these riches and fully exploit their potential, Britain would need far more than just miners and prospectors. It would require complete political control over the region. In 1874, Henry Herbert, the Secretary of State for the Colonies, proposed a grand and ambitious design to unify the various Boer settlements and British holdings into a single cohesive federation. This federation, he argued, would streamline governance, prevent the endless quarrels and disputes over territory, and most importantly, give Britain effective control over the lucrative diamond fields that were rapidly transforming the region. On paper, it looked like a path toward order and stability. In reality, it was a deeply provocative move that inflamed existing tensions and set the stage for future conflict. The Boers, fiercely independent and deeply distrustful of outside interference, recoiled at the very thought of federation. They had trekked into the vast wilderness specifically to escape the control of empire, not to be willingly folded back into its suffocating embrace. To them, Herbert's proposed federation was nothing more than a cage, designed to trap them and steal their hard-won autonomy. Even the promise of prosperity and economic advancement could not soften their deep-seated distrust of London and its imperial ambitions. They saw British interference not as a genuine partnership, but as a thinly veiled attempt at theft and exploitation. Meanwhile, African communities living near Kimberley bore the heaviest burdens of the diamond rush. Thousands were pressed into forced labor under harsh and exploitative contracts, their basic rights and dignity routinely ignored. Their ancestral lands were systematically encroached upon by powerful mining companies that viewed them as mere obstacles to be removed in the relentless pursuit of profit. Wealth flowed freely from the soil, but it flowed almost exclusively outward, into British banks, shipping lanes, and the imperial coffers, enriching a distant elite while leaving the local population impoverished and marginalized. Diamonds, far more than gold or land, accelerated the inevitable collision between empire and independence in South Africa. They drew Britain deeper into the continent's interior, setting the stage for future struggles not only with the Boers, but also with one of Africa's most formidable and powerful peoples, the Zulu. Long before Britain's covetous eyes fell upon them, the Zulu had already forged a well-deserved reputation as one of the most disciplined and fearsome military powers in all of Africa. Under the visionary leadership of King Shaka in the early 19th century, they transformed from a relatively small clan into a vast and dominant kingdom that exerted its influence over much of southern Africa. Shaka's innovative reforms, including tight regimental organization, rigorous drills and training, and the introduction of the deadly short stabbing spear known as the Ikluwa, turned Zulu warriors into a force to be reckoned with, capable of shattering their enemies through speed, precision, and overwhelming numbers. By the 1870s, Shaka had long since passed away, but his enduring legacy lived on in the highly disciplined armies of his successor, King Cetshwayo. Numbering in the tens of thousands, the Zulu military was still drilled to perfection, adhering to the same strict standards and innovative tactics that had made them so formidable in the past. Their signature tactics, including the use of outflanking horns to encircle an enemy while the main chest of warriors struck head-on, remained devastatingly effective on the battlefield. To the British officials stationed at the Cape, however, this extraordinary military strength was seen less as a testament to Zulu ingenuity and more as an existential threat that needed to be neutralized at all costs. In 1877, Britain formally annexed the Boer Republic of the Transvaal, bringing them directly into conflict with Zulu territory and setting the stage for future hostilities. Colonial officials, ambitious and eager for further conquest, crafted a carefully calculated plan. They would deliberately provoke the Zulu into initiating a conflict and then use this Zulu aggression as a convenient excuse for annexation and total control. Sir Henry Bartle Frere, the High Commissioner of Southern Africa, sent an audacious ultimatum to Cetshwayo, demanding that he disband his entire army and accept British authority without question. It was not a genuine offer of negotiation, but a calculated insult designed to elicit a predictable response. Cetshwayo's reply was simple and unequivocal. No, he would not dismantle the very backbone of his kingdom at the whim of a foreign power. And so in January of 1879, British columns marched into Zulu land, confident in their ability to quickly subdue the defiant kingdom. They came with approximately 1,800 soldiers, firmly believing that their superior rifles, powerful artillery, and unwavering imperial discipline would swiftly cow their seemingly primitive enemy. Instead, they found themselves outmaneuvered and decisively defeated in one of the most stunning military upsets in British colonial history. On January 22nd, at the Battle of Isandlwana, the Zulus struck with devastating precision, unleashing their full military might upon the unsuspecting British. Hidden by the rolling hills that characterized the landscape, tens of thousands of Zulu warriors swept around the British camp, encircling it with their expertly coordinated horns of the buffalo formation. The Redcoats fired volley after volley, their Martini Henry rifles cutting swathes through the advancing masses of Zulu warriors. But the Zulu tide did not stop, its momentum seemingly unstoppable. Ammunition began to run dangerously low as the British had neglected to properly fortify their position. Confident that no native force could possibly match them in open combat, their initial confidence quickly dissolved into utter chaos and panic as the Zulu warriors pressed their attack with unwavering ferocity. By the day's end, the Zulu had completely overrun the camp, inflicting a catastrophic defeat upon the British. More than 1,300 British soldiers and colonial troops lay dead on the battlefield, marking the greatest defeat the Empire had yet suffered in Africa. To London, the news of Isandlwana sent a shockwave of disbelief and outrage. To the Zulu, it was a moment of profound vindication, clear proof that their kingdom was no mere relic of the past, but a living and breathing power capable of humbling even the mightiest empire on earth. But even in their moment of triumph, Cetshwayo fully understood that the empire would not easily forgive such a humiliating defeat. The Zulu had undeniably won a significant battle, but in doing so, they had awakened a storm of imperial retribution that would soon descend upon them. On the very night that the slaughter at Isandlwana sent shockwaves rippling across the empire, another story was already being written, one that would ultimately soothe British pride. and reinforced the enduring myth of imperial heroism and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. It unfolded at a small and relatively insignificant mission station called Rorke's Drift, a lonely outpost of mud walls and thatched roofs precariously perched astride the Buffalo River. Inside were barely 150 men, most of them engineers and hospital orderlies, commanded by two relatively junior lieutenants, John Chard and Gonville Bromhead. Many were exhausted and demoralized, still reeling from the devastating news of the defeat at Isandlwana. Then, scouts brought word that a Zulu force of more than 4,000 warriors was rapidly approaching their position. For most of the men, the logical course of action was clear: abandon the undefendable post and flee to safety. But Chard and Bromhead made a different, far more audacious choice. They resolved to defend the mission station to the last man. They quickly fortified the station as best they could, stacking mealie bags into makeshift barricades, hammering planks into firing positions, and preparing for the inevitable Zulu assault. The patients in the hospital were too wounded to be moved, leaving the garrison with no choice but to fight not only for themselves, but also for those who were unable to run or defend themselves. The attack came in relentless waves, each more ferocious than the last. Zulu warriors surged forward with spears flashing and muskets cracking, their deafening war cries filling the air. The defenders fired in steady volleys, each Martini Henry rifle barking flame and death. The makeshift barricades shook violently under the sheer force of the Zulu impact. Shields. The Zulu slammed against hastily built walls, and desperate fighting erupted around the hospital. Soon the thatched roof was ablaze, and soldiers risked their lives dragging the wounded, one by one, through holes they chopped in the walls. The battle raged for a brutal 12 hours. Ammunition ran low and exhaustion set in. Despite it all, the defenders held their ground. When dawn finally broke, the Zulu had retreated, leaving behind hundreds of fallen warriors. Amazingly, only 17 of the garrison had been killed. News of Rorke's Drift spread like wildfire across Britain. After the humiliating defeat at Isandlwana, here was a story of courage, defiance, and victory against seemingly impossible odds. The Empire seized upon it, celebrating the triumph. 11 Victoria Crosses, the most ever awarded for a single action in British history, were bestowed upon the heroes. Paintings, songs, and later movies immortalized Rorke's Drift as a tale of grit and perseverance, a symbol of British resilience even in the face of utter darkness. However, beneath the heroic legend lay a much harsher reality. The battle had been one of pure survival, not conquest or strategic advantage. The Zulu had fought with just as much bravery, and their losses far exceeded those of the defenders. But their story, their heroism, would find no place in the official British narrative. The Empire remembers only what flatters it and burnishes its image. The dead at Isandlwana were conveniently forgotten, but the heroes of Rorke's Drift were celebrated as undeniable proof that the Empire, though bloodied, would absolutely not bow. And indeed, Britain had no intention of bowing. If the Zulu had demonstrated their strength, Britain would now demonstrate its vengeance and overwhelming power. In the wake of Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift, Britain faced a critical decision: withdraw from Zululand or return with overwhelming force to crush the Zulu once and for all. For an empire whose pride had been so deeply wounded, retreat was simply unthinkable. London demanded redemption, retribution, and complete victory. A second invasion was meticulously planned, this time with no illusions and absolutely no careless underestimation of the Zulu. Months later, when the British columns once again crossed into Zululand, they advanced like a relentless machine. Engineers constructed fortified camps at every stop. Soldiers marched in tight, disciplined formations. Cavalry patrolled the flanks, and artillery was positioned with deadly precision. Gone was the arrogance that had characterized the first campaign. In its place was cold, methodical calculation. The Zulu prepared to resist again. King Cetshwayo still commanded tens of thousands of warriors, but he understood that the odds had drastically shifted against him. The British now possessed Gatling guns and mountain artillery, devastating tools of war that the Zulu simply could not match. The warriors who had triumphed at Isandlwana would now face an impenetrable wall of steel and fire. On July 4, 1879, the two forces clashed at Ulundi. the Zulu capital. The British formed a hollow square, bayonets bristling outward, artillery positioned at each corner and cavalry poised to strike. The Zulu impi charged in wave after wave, their war cries echoing across the open veldt. Spears struck shields, bullets tore through flesh, and the field filled with thick smoke and screams of agony. Time and again, the Zulus surged forward with incredible courage, only to be cut down by relentless volleys of rifle fire and the devastating chatter of the Gatling guns. Finally, the British cavalry swept out from the square, slashing into the retreating ranks. The Zulu line broke, and their warriors scattered. Ulundi fell. The great royal homesteads were burned to ash. Cetshwayo was captured and later exiled, and his kingdom was shattered. The war that had begun with humiliation ended in ruthless triumph. Britain annexed Zululand, adding another jewel, stained with blood though it was, to the imperial crown. In London, the victory was hailed as vindication, conclusive proof that the empire could not be humbled for long. Yet the cost had been immense. Thousands of Zulu dead lay as a stark testament to the empire's iron will, and a once proud kingdom was reduced to a mere colonial subject. But conquest did not bring lasting peace. Even as Britain celebrated its victory over the Zulu, another storm was brewing in South Africa. The Boers, deeply resentful of British interference and emboldened by their fierce independence, were quietly preparing to rise in rebellion. The empire had crushed one enemy, but another, equally determined, waited just over the horizon. No sooner had the Union Jack been raised over Zululand than unrest began to stir in another quarter. The Boers, the Dutch-speaking farmers who had trekked deep into the interior decades earlier, watched Britain's ever-expanding shadow with growing alarm and resentment. Their republic in the Transvaal had already been annexed in 1877, a move justified by British officials as a measure of protection. In reality, it was simply conquest disguised as benevolence and concern. The Boers were not a people easily subdued. They were stubborn, fiercely independent, and accustomed to a life of hardship on the frontier. This tough existence had honed them into skilled riders and expert marksmen. To them, Britain's annexation was nothing short of tyranny, another blatant attempt to bind free men under foreign chains. By 1880, their patience had finally snapped. The First Boer War had begun. It was unlike Britain's other colonial conflicts. There were no grand set-piece battles, no storming of capitals, and no hollow squares of red coats facing spear-wielding warriors. Instead, the Boers fought from the shadows, employing guerrilla tactics to their full advantage. Mounted on hardy ponies, they struck in sudden raids, ambushing convoys and melting back into the vast veldt before reinforcements could arrive. They knew the land intimately. Every ridge, every waterhole, every patch of scrub offered potential cover. British columns blundered after ghosts, growing weary, frustrated and demoralized. The fighting culminated in February 1881 at the Battle of Majuba Hill. British troops, confident that they held the high ground, entrenched themselves on the summit. The Boers, undeterred, scaled the slopes with uncanny skill, using every bit of available cover and employing sharp shooting to deadly effect. By the end of the day, the British position had completely collapsed. Over 90 men were killed, including Major General George Colley, the commander himself. For the Empire, it was yet another devastating humiliation. This time, however, London hesitated. Memories of Isandlwana were still fresh, and the British public had little appetite for yet another costly and protracted war on a distant frontier. Instead of escalating the conflict, Britain chose compromise. The Transvaal was granted self-government once more, its independence restored, albeit under British suzerainty. For the Boers, it was a resounding triumph, a vindication of their stubborn defiance. For Britain, it was a bitter pill to swallow, a concession forced by unfavorable circumstances. But beneath the uneasy peace lay a truth that both sides fully understood. This was not the end. Diamonds had already made the region far too valuable for Britain to ignore. And gold, which would soon be discovered in vast quantities, would make it absolutely priceless. The empire would inevitably return, and next time it would not leave so easily. While South Africa seethed with rebellion and resentment, Britain's eyes were also fixed on the north, specifically on Egypt, a land whose strategic value had skyrocketed with the construction of a single channel of water. In 1869, after years of back-breaking labor and staggering expense, the Suez Canal finally opened. For the first time in history, European ships could bypass the long and treacherous journey around Africa's Cape of Good Hope, sailing directly from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and onward to Asia. For Britain, whose entire empire rested on its control of India, the canal was nothing less than a vital lifeline. Whoever controlled the Suez Canal controlled the very artery of the empire, yet Egypt itself was crumbling from within. Years of extravagance and gross mismanagement by the Khedives, the hereditary rulers, had driven the state deep into debt. Lavish palaces, failed development projects, and even a botched invasion of Ethiopia had completely emptied the treasury. By the late 1870s, European creditors, particularly British and French, all but owned Egypt's finances, effectively controlling the country's economy. Resentment grew among Egyptians, who watched their nation reduced to a mere pawn in the hands of foreign powers. In 1879, this resentment exploded into open revolt. Ahmed Urabi, a charismatic army officer, rose to lead a powerful nationalist movement, demanding an end to foreign domination. Crowds filled the streets of Cairo, chanting his name and calling for liberation. And for the first time in centuries, Egypt's future seemed to belong to Egyptians themselves. But in London, Urabi was not viewed as a reformer or a patriot. He was portrayed as a direct threat to commerce, to stability, and above all to the Suez Canal. Britain intervened swiftly and decisively. In July 1882, British warships anchored off the coast of Alexandria, their guns trained on the city. As tensions escalated, the solution chosen was as brutal as it was tragically familiar. Bombardment. Cannon thundered, shells tore into the ancient port, and flames consumed entire districts. The city burned as its residents fled in utter panic. In order to restore order, the empire first reduced one of the Mediterranean's greatest cities to smoldering ruin. Soon after, British troops marched inland. At Tel el-Kebir, they met Urabi's forces. Though brave and determined, the nationalists were no match for British discipline and superior firepower. The battle was swift, and the defeat was decisive. Urabi was captured and exiled, and the deposed Khedive Muhammad Tewfik Pasha was restored to his throne, though in truth, he now ruled only at Britain's pleasure. From that moment on, Egypt was effectively under British control. Soldiers garrisoned Cairo, administrators oversaw the nation's finances, and the Suez Canal became an imperial highway secured by British guns. Though Egypt remained an Ottoman province in name, in reality, it was a British protectorate in all but name. Egyptians would not regain a significant measure of independence until 1922. For Britain, the conquest of Egypt was a triumph of strategy, securing the vital gateway to India and the rest of its Asian empire. For Egypt, it was yet another chapter in a long and painful history of foreign domination, written in fire and smoke against the skies above Alexandria. By the early 1880s, Africa was no longer just a backdrop for scattered wars and isolated trading posts. It was rapidly becoming the object of an unprecedented frenzy, a scramble for territory, resources, and above all, prestige. The Industrial Revolution had irrevocably changed everything. Factories in Europe demanded raw materials in staggering quantities: palm oil for soap, rubber for machines, copper for wires, and gold and diamonds for ever-increasing wealth. Population pressures swelled Europe's cities, leaving the poor restless and governments eager to find new outlets for their ambition and energy. Politicians and businessmen alike began to view Africa not as an impenetrable mystery, but as a golden opportunity ripe for exploitation. Yet this sudden hunger carried significant risks. France, Germany, Portugal, and Britain all aggressively pressed their claims, each nation fearful that its rivals might seize too much of the prize. The old system of coastal trading posts was no longer sufficient. The continent's vast interior, largely unmapped and filled with kingdoms and societies that Europeans scarcely understood, was the ultimate prize. Tensions mounted rapidly, threatening to erupt into open war between the European powers. It was then that Germany's Chancellor Otto von Bismarck convened a meeting in Berlin in 1884. Representatives from 13 European nations and the United States gathered in glittering halls beneath ornate chandeliers to decide Africa's fate. Conspicuously absent from the conference were the very people whose lives would be irrevocably reshaped by its outcomes. No African ruler, chief, or emissary sat at the table. The Berlin Conference essentially set the rules for the partition of Africa. Coastal claims had to be backed by effective occupation of the interior. Boundaries were to be drawn, spheres of influence declared, and disputes settled through negotiation rather than open European warfare. It was, in effect, a carving up of an entire continent. Lines on maps were carelessly slashed across lands whose peoples and histories the delegates barely bothered to consider. In the aftermath, Africa's future was effectively sealed. The scramble began in earnest. Explorers mapped rivers and mountains, merchants staked their claims, and armies marched inland to plant flags over territories that had never even heard of Europe, much less Berlin. Britain, though cautious at first, quickly embraced the scramble for Africa. The empire already controlled strategic points at the Cape and the Suez Canal. Now, with rivals pressing on every frontier, Britain sought to fill in the spaces between, expanding its reach from north to south, from sea to shining sea. It was a grand dream of continental continuity, a bold ribbon of red stretching across maps in classrooms and drawing rooms alike. The Berlin Conference may have appeared to establish order, but on the ground, it unleashed chaos. Communities that had coexisted peacefully for centuries suddenly found themselves divided by invisible borders, claimed in the name of kings they had never seen. For Africans, it was the beginning of a devastating storm from which there would be no refuge. For centuries, Africa's vast interior had been known as the white man's grave. It was not armies or fortresses that had kept Europeans at bay, but disease. Malaria, yellow fever, dysentery. These invisible foes struck down sailors, traders, and soldiers alike. Even the strongest men rarely lasted long beyond the humid coasts. Expansion inland seemed virtually impossible. But by the late 19th century, advances in science and industry began to tip the balance decisively in favor of the Europeans. Steamships, once confined to the rivers of Europe, now churned up the Congo, the Niger, and the Nile, pushing ever farther into the very heart of the continent. Railways followed, cutting across savannah and jungle, stitching together far-flung imperial outposts. Iron tracks made distance irrelevant. Supplies and troops could now be moved with unprecedented speed and efficiency to places where once only slow-moving caravans had dared to tread. Even more decisive was medicine. Quinine, extracted from the bark of the cinchona tree, emerged as a potent weapon against malaria. Though bitter and imperfect, it kept the fevers at bay long enough for expeditions to survive in previously uninhabitable regions. What had once been a certain death sentence became, with a daily dose of quinine, survivable. Yellow fever still haunted the coasts, but it no longer ended campaigns before they even began. And then there were the weapons. The Maxim gun, first demonstrated in 1884, was a revolution in death. Capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute, it gave European armies a terrible and overwhelming advantage over indigenous forces armed with muskets, spears, or swords. A single machine gun, strategically entrenched on a ridge, could sweep away entire regiments in a matter of minutes. To London and Paris, it was not merely a technological marvel, it was reassurance. With steel, fire, and medicine, the interior of Africa was no longer forbidden. For Britain, this meant a new level of confidence bordering on arrogance. Officials, still smarting from past humiliations at Isandlwana and Majuba Hill, convinced themselves that the era of being humbled by native armies was definitively over. With quinine in their kits and Maxim guns on the field, they confidently believed that no African kingdom could possibly withstand them. But the empire's new tools did not erase old mistakes. Overconfidence still lingered. The contemptuous assumption that Africans would simply fold before modern weapons often led to rash decisions, reckless advances, and wars far bloodier and more costly than London had ever anticipated. The empire had unlocked the gates of Africa, but stepping through them would mean endless conflict, resistance, and atrocities, disguised as progress and civilization. The age of limited coastal trade was over. Now empire marched inland, utterly convinced that technology had made it invincible. By the late 19th century, the Kingdom of Benin stood as one of West Africa's most renowned and powerful states. Centered in what is now southern Nigeria, Benin was famed for its artistry, its intricate bronze castings, and its elaborate city of earthen walls and grand courtyards. Its Oba, or king, presided over a wealthy kingdom that had traded with Europeans for centuries, yet fiercely guarded its independence and autonomy. The British, however, had grown increasingly impatient. Palm oil and rubber from the region were in high demand, and Benin's reluctance to fully open its markets to imperial traders was seen not as a sovereign right, but as blatant obstruction and defiance. In 1897, a British official named James Robert Phillips attempted a bold and ultimately disastrous maneuver. With approximately 250 African soldiers disguised as porters and escorts, he advanced toward Benin City under the pretense of diplomacy and negotiation. His true aim, however, was to force open the kingdom to complete British control. The plan ended in utter disaster. The force was intercepted, and nearly all of them were killed in what Britain would later call the Benin Massacre. Only 2 officers managed to escape with their lives. In London, outrage flared, fueled by sensationalized reports in the British press. But behind the outrage lay a convenient opportunity. The deaths provided the perfect pretext that Britain had been eagerly awaiting. Within weeks, a punitive expedition of 200 men was assembled, armed to the teeth. This time they came openly as an invading force, with rifles, artillery, and Maxim guns. Villages along the way were burned to the ground. Resistance was fierce, but the outcome was essentially foreordained. After a 10-day siege, British troops stormed Benin City. What they found astonished even them: vast compounds, intricate architecture, and thousands upon thousands of bronzes, ivories, and other artworks that testified to centuries of cultural brilliance and artistic achievement. And then, true to deeply ingrained imperial habit, they proceeded to systematically destroy it. The city was deliberately set ablaze. Temples and palaces were reduced to ashes. The priceless bronzes, irreplaceable masterpieces of African civilization, were looted and shipped back to Europe, where they still sit in museums and private collections today. To Britain, it was a victory, neatly wrapped in the familiar language of justice and retribution. To Benin, it was utter devastation, the obliteration of a kingdom's heart and soul. A civilization that had thrived for centuries long before Europeans even arrived was brutally humiliated, and its cultural treasures were scattered across the globe. The fall of Benin laid bare the empire's naked logic. Admiration for African culture did not lead to respect or recognition. It led to looting, appropriation, and the systematic erasure of history. Britain marveled at what it destroyed and destroyed what it could not fully control or exploit. If diamonds had already drawn Britain deeper into South Africa, gold would inevitably pull it into the bloodiest and most protracted struggle of all. In the 1880s, prospectors in the Transvaal struck upon immense deposits of gold, the richest that the world had ever seen. The discovery transformed the once isolated Boer Republic into a prize that every major empire coveted. To London, leaving such unimaginable wealth in the hands of the Boers was simply unthinkable. Enter Cecil Rhodes, empire builder, ruthless businessman, and passionate dreamer of a British Africa stretching seamlessly from Cape Town to Cairo. Rhodes perfectly embodied the ruthless ambition and unbridled greed of the age. As the founder of the British South Africa Company and a leading figure in Cape politics, he viewed the Boers not as neighbors, or even as potential partners, but merely as obstacles standing in the way of his grand imperial vision. Where diplomacy faltered, he readily turned to provocation, manipulation, and outright aggression. His company funded incursions, manipulated markets, and stoked tensions, all carefully designed to bring the Transvaal under complete imperial control. By 1899, the inevitable had finally erupted: the Second Boer War. Unlike the brief skirmishes of the past, this was total war, a conflict that would test the limits of both sides. The Boers, masters of guerrilla tactics, struck swiftly, and then vanished back into the vastness of the veldt. They knew the terrain intimately, rode fast ponies, and carried Mauser rifles that matched the British in range and deadly accuracy. British troops, though far more numerous, found themselves constantly harried, ambushed, and humiliated in the early stages of the war. London responded with unprecedented ferocity. Reinforcements poured in until British forces swelled to nearly 500,000 men. The Empire unleashed a brutal, scorched earth campaign, burning Boer farms, destroying crops, and seizing livestock. Families were forcibly driven from their homes. Women and children, alongside black Africans caught in the crossfire of the conflict, were herded into concentration camps, the first of their kind in modern history. Conditions within the camps were absolutely horrific. Overcrowding, rampant disease, and deliberate starvation claimed tens of thousands of innocent lives. By the war's end, nearly 26,000 Boer women and children and an estimated 20,000 Africans had perished behind barbed wire, victims of the Empire's brutal policies. For 3 long years, the struggle dragged on, a grinding war of attrition. The Boers fought with grim determination, refusing to surrender even as their homes were destroyed and their families were imprisoned. But by 1902, exhausted, outnumbered, and facing utter ruin, they finally capitulated. The Boer republics were absorbed into the Empire, united with the Cape Colony and Natal in what eventually became the Union of South Africa. To Britain, the war was a hard-fought victory, conclusive proof that no colony could ultimately defy the Empire's immense might. But it was a victory deeply poisoned by its staggering cost. International outrage at the horrific conditions in the concentration camps severely tarnished Britain's reputation on the world stage. At home, the British public wrestled with a growing unease at the brutal methods employed in the name of empire. And beneath it all, the insidious seeds of apartheid had been firmly planted. By granting political privilege solely to white settlers while systematically sidelining African voices and concerns, Britain ensured that the new Union of South Africa would be built upon a foundation of deep-seated inequality and racial injustice. In Cecil Rhodes's twisted vision of empire, there was no room for true justice, only for relentless conquest and domination. By the dawn of the 20th century, Britain's empire in Africa stretched wider than ever before. From Cape Town to Cairo, the red of the Union Jack seemed unbroken, a symbol of unchallenged power. Yet beneath the bold colors on the map lay deep fractures, simmering resentments, simmering rebellions, and the ever-present costs of conquest. One of the bloodiest reminders of this cost came in Sudan. There, the Mahdist revolt, which had claimed the life of General Charles Gordon at Khartoum in 1885, still raged on. Led by Muhammad Ahmad, the self-declared Mahdi, Sudanese fighters had united various tribes and villages under a common banner of resistance to foreign rule. For 13 long years, British and Egyptian forces fought bitter desert campaigns against them, struggling to suppress the rebellion. It was not until 1898, at the Battle of Omdurman, that General Kitchener's modern army, backed by overwhelming firepower from machine guns and artillery, finally crushed the Mahdist forces in a storm of fire. Tens of thousands of Sudanese fell in a single day, effectively ending Sudan's independence for a generation. Gordon's death had finally been avenged, but the victory left a lingering bitter taste. It was stark proof of the empire's immense might, but also of its utter mercilessness. With conquest now complete, Britain turned its attention from further expansion to consolidation and control. In 1904, the Entente cordiale with France ended decades of rivalry, freeing both nations to focus on a rising challenger on the European continent, Germany. Africa, once a prize fought over by competing European powers, now became a staging ground for future conflicts yet to come. In South Africa, the Union created in 1910 brought Boers and Britons together under a single flag, but deliberately excluded Africans. White minority rule was firmly entrenched, paving the way for the codified system of apartheid that would come to dominate the country for decades. Across the continent, Britain invested heavily in railways, telegraphs, and ports, projects that knitted together far-flung territories for efficient trade and centralized governance. Many of these structures still stand today, physical reminders of the imperial era. Yet these legacies were undeniably double-edged. The railways carried soldiers and weapons as often as they carried goods and commerce. The telegraph transmitted commands of subjugation and control as frequently as it facilitated trade. Every beam and every track was laid at a terrible cost. Lives disrupted, cultures destabilized, and ancient traditions forever altered. And then, after the Second World War, came the inevitable unraveling. The empire that once boldly claimed the mantle of eternity began its slow, irreversible retreat. In 1961, the Union of South Africa severed its final ties with Britain, formally declaring itself a republic. One by one, colonies across Africa claimed their independence, their national flags rising proudly in place of the Union Jack. What remained was a complex paradox. On one hand, colonial architecture, legal systems, and infrastructure endured, shaping the landscape of many African nations. On the other hand, the deep scars of violence, exploitation, and deeply ingrained racial hierarchies lingered, profoundly shaping these nations' paths long after independence. The empire had claimed that it brought civilization to Africa, but it ultimately left behind a legacy of division, inequality, and enduring resentment. Yet Africa is not solely defined by the shadow of empire. Today, many of its nations are among the fastest-growing economies in the world, building vibrant futures that transcend the limitations of their colonial pasts. In some cases, their economic growth even surpasses that of their former occupiers, a powerful symbol of resilience and renewal. The empires came to Africa with guns, greed, and fluttering flags. But the continent endures, steadily rising again from the ashes of its twilight. The story of Britain in Africa is not a simple tale of unbridled triumph, nor is it simply a tragic narrative of oppression and exploitation. It is a complex story of ambition and arrogance, of resistance and resilience, of countless lives lost and futures remade. From Khartoum to Cape Town, from Benin to Cairo, the empire's path is indelibly written not only in red ink upon old maps, but in blood, ash, and memory.